One of the defining things about the war in Ukraine right now is the Russian offensive in the east, especially around Avdiivka. It started in the middle of October and it's still going on, and it has meant that Russia has successfully seized the initiative in this phase of the war. But I think it came as a surprise for most people that Russia would be able to do this, that they have the resources to launch an offensive at this point, and I haven't really talked about it on this channel. So let's talk about it. If we look at 2023 as a whole, then there have been three big offensives. The year started with a Russian winter offensive in the east, where they tried to break the Ukrainian lines in Donetsk and Luhansk. It seemed that this was a promise that the Russian military leaders had made to Putin, that if they were allowed to leave the city of Kherson, then they could deliver some results in the east because it would free up a lot of resources. But it didn't really work for them. The Ukrainians managed to hold the line, and the Russian winter offensive was mostly a failure. They did eventually manage to take the city of Bakhmut, but it consumed a lot of resources, and it was a pretty poor result when you look at the scale of the whole offensive. The Russian winter offensive was then followed by a Ukrainian summer offensive. There were very big hopes attached to this Ukrainian offensive, but it never really materialized. I've discussed that in different videos, and we also talked about it in a recent interview I did with Jonathan Fink over at Silicon Curtain. So if you're interested in that, I recommend you find the Silicon Curtain channel and watch the interview. But I think it is fair to say that the Ukrainian offensive finished in October when Russia launched their new offensive in the east. So we can call that the Russian fall offensive. And in broad strokes, I think we can say that it looks very much like the winter offensive. It has more or less the same goals. It is conducted very much in the same way. And I would also say that so far it's produced more or less the same results as the winter offensive, namely almost nothing. So we have had three big offensives, two from Russia and one from Ukraine, and they've all been unsuccessful. So this really does demonstrate that point that the Ukrainian Chief of Defense, General Zaluzhny, made in his article in The Economist, that there is now a kind of positional deadlock in the war, because the weapons that both sides have in this conflict are such that the defender has massive advantages over the attacker. And most prominently, the extensive use of drones that both sides have means that the element of surprise has almost disappeared from the battlefield. It's just not possible for an attacker to get into a position for a surprise attack because the troops are spotted long before they get to the front line. So there is this situation where the defender has the advantages, and it looks like both sides are unable to move the front line. But the Russian offensive is interesting anyways. First, I would say that it shows that Russia still has offensive ambitions. There is still a lot of people in the West who think that Russia is pretty happy about how things are going and where the front line is, but that is not the case. They have annexed large parts of Ukraine, so it's written into the Russian constitution that these areas are a part of Russia. And a lot of that is still under Ukrainian control. So Putin has still not managed to deliver on those promises of getting control over the areas that they consider Russian territory. And that is an unacceptable situation from a Russian perspective. So it is a non-negotiable requirement for the Russian army to take these territories. And that is one of the reasons why they are pushing on for this offensive. And then there are also some other more, we can say, personal, political reasons. Like Putin has a re-election in March, and he would like to show off some positive results from the war. And right now, in the Russian media, the situation is actually that they're sort of trying to downplay the war. It's not the top news story, and when they do mention it, it's usually about some pretty insignificant incident or just sort of the defense minister saying that they've destroyed a fantastic number of Western tanks or something like that. So the official line is also not that there is an offensive going on, but that they're conducting what they call an active defense. So they are trying to sort of downplay the significance of of the war so that it is not a political issue. And of course, Putin would like to use this war in his election campaign, but that requires the army to deliver some results. And then there is also figures like the defense minister Shoigu and the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov. They want to deliver results so that they can show that they are valuable to Putin, so that eventually they get to keep their job. So there are such, we could say, personal and political reasons also for why Russia is conducting this offensive. I think the most surprising thing about the offensive is not so much that Russia wants to do it. It's also not really the brutality by which it's carried out. They use the same kinds of human meat wave tactics that we also saw in the winter offensive, and it's a very ugly kind of war. They take huge casualties, but it's something that we've seen before. So I think the surprising thing about this Russian offensive is rather that they have the resources to do it. So if we go back to September, then many people were saying that Putin would order another wave of mobilization because Russia was about to run out of soldiers. And then not only did Putin not order more mobilization, but it also turned out that they actually had enough reserves to launch an offensive and then take the initiative in the war just a few weeks later. So I don't want to overstate this argument. Like, this fall offensive is not going particularly well for Russia, and the forces that they are mustering, it's far from enough. Like, you need a very large force if you want to break the Ukrainian defense. But still, I mean, it is impressive that they have the forces to even try. And also, I will say that when they do this, then that shows that they're pretty self-confident about it. Like, Putin's re-election is in March, and it is guaranteed that the next chance of a mobilization is on the other side of that. So they must be confident that they can manage with the current number of troops and the current recruitment pipeline until at least well into the spring. And at the current pace of attrition, Russia is losing somewhere around 20,000 soldiers per month, and that adds up to a huge number over time. So I will say that I have personally been surprised by how well Russia seems to be able to recruit for this war without actually conducting a mobilization. The way they're doing it is that it's a combination of different sources of personnel. So some of them are volunteers that sign up for big bonuses, for example. And others come from prisons because they can get a pardon if they take a deployment to Ukraine. And then some are also migrant workers from Central Asian countries. Russia uses sort of a variety of, we can say, stick and carrot tools to motivate migrant workers to join the army. Some of them do it because they have the promise of Russian citizenship, and others do it to get out of legal trouble. The Russian police has actually made a campaign against migrant workers to see if they can catch more of them in all kinds of sort of different criminal cases, so that some of them will join the army to get out of that. And I will say that I was not expecting all of these different efforts to work as well as they have, but it looks like, at least for a while, it has worked, and Russia has been able to find a large number of soldiers in this way. And then finally, a very important reason why Russia has managed to avoid another round of mobilization is also that they're not rotating the soldiers that they mobilized last September. So these people that were unlucky and were part of the first wave of mobilization, they have been on the front line for over a year. And they will never be replaced, because doing that would require the mobilization of someone else to take their spot. So these are some of the reflections about the reasons for why Russia is conducting this offensive, and about why it is to some extent surprising that they've been able to do it. The last thing I just want to touch upon is how I think it's going to go from there. I think Russia is going to push on for the foreseeable future. So right now, the tempo of the Russian offensive has kind of decreased because of the weather conditions. They're not very favorable. There's just too much mud and water everywhere in Ukraine right now. But later in the winter, the soil is going to freeze, and that will make it possible to make bigger maneuvers again. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether Russia or Ukraine will try to take advantage of the winter weather. But I think the most likely scenario is that Russia will try to stay on the offensive. First, they have the motivation to do it, and it would be politically important for Putin to achieve some results before the election in March. But just as important, I think that when we listen to the Ukrainian officials that are talking about this, then it seems like Ukraine is right now trying to set expectations that people should not expect a new big Ukrainian offensive anytime soon. Like instead, Ukraine will probably remain on the defensive for a long period of time. In this video, I'm looking at the Russian offensive, so I will not go deep into the Ukrainian strategy right now. But I think there are several reasons why Ukraine will prefer to stay on the defensive for some time. First, it fits General Zaluzhny's analysis that it is the defender that has the tactical advantage in the war at the moment. But also there is right now a lot of uncertainty about the supply security from especially the United States. So if Ukraine don't know how many weapons they will receive next year, then they have to say whatever the weapons they have already. They can't afford to go out and spend a lot of them. And that means that they really can't launch another offensive before there is some supply security again. So therefore, I think Russia will remain on the offensive for the time being, both because Russia wants to be on the offensive, but also because Ukraine would prefer right now to stay on the defensive. If you found this video helpful or informative, please give it a like and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.